reset in the way the world tackles climate change. The former PM's warning the way we're looking at it now is causing public disengagement, division and policy failure. Let's speak to Ryan Wayne, Executive Director of Politics at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. What has Tony Blair been saying to you, Ryan?
Well, Tony Blair's been saying it to the wider world, and the paper today sets out what we call the climate paradox, which is really simple, actually. The awareness of climate change has never been higher. The appetite for action has never been higher. But the paradox and the crux of the issue is that emissions are going up, not down, and there's a palpable sense amongst the public, both here and in other countries, that the current policy trajectory, the things that we're doing now, just aren't sufficient or aren't enough. And what we're calling for in this paper is a change both in the politics, but most significantly in the policy around climate change.
So do you think that the current policy of the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, the Labour Minister, and his net zero plans, do you think they're turning people off the climate plans?
No, not really. I've studied Ed Miliband's Secretary of State's plans, and he talks about things like nuclear and the need for investment in nuclear energy, and that's exactly one of the recommendations of this paper. I think what we're saying is, look, any measures that make people feel poorer or powerless or say to developing countries, stop developing, I think we've got to relegate those because they will create a political backlash. What we're saying is some of the things that the Secretary of State's been calling for, new energy sources, like a focus on nuclear, directing real and political capital towards things like carbon capture. So this is smart technology that exists already and can capture emissions at source. Directing political energy and political capital towards that to scale it up is the way forward. And if you look at something like COP, which your programme and your listeners will be well aware of, you'll cover it later on this year in Brazil. COP's fantastic at getting people into a room and talking about how they're going to reduce emissions. But frankly, that's got to change.
Yeah, that's the problem. They're very good at getting in a room, travelling around the world doing speeches, but they either don't come to an agreement or, like the Paris Agreement, they never met their targets. There's a lot of conversation, but very little result.
Yeah, a little less conversation, a little more action, please. I think that could sum up this paper nicely. And look, I think climate activists have done a fantastic job of getting us to the starting point of this paper, which is awareness being up and acceptance of climate change as an issue. But I do think now we need a step change in the policy focus. And forums like COP need to be less about scaling how we reduce emissions that can have an impact on people's livelihoods and growth, and needs to become more about how we scale the technological solutions that the paper identifies and calls for.
Isn't the truth that a lot of people, as you touched on, are fearful of becoming poorer in the race to be better for our environment? It will cost more money to make the switch, to make the change, whether that be heat pumps or switching your car or getting rid of a gas boiler.
Yeah, I think people are feeling full of that, but I think this is why we're calling for the change in policy, in order to make people feel much more secure around the direction of travel with.
And how would it happen, Ryan? How do you do that? How do you square the circle there?
Well, I think you start off by reading the excellent paper from the Tony Blair Institute today, and what's required around that then is political will and focus. And you'll expect, there's so many politicians on this programme, and you know that priorities matter. And what we're saying is start to really prioritise technology in the policy mix and the policy solutions. And I think it has got to come from government, both in the UK and globally as well. If you get that priority there, I think you will start to see a bit of a step change in some of the policies that are being pursued.
Yeah, and I remember when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, he was saying that the climate emergency is one of the number one issues, and that was many years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was reading a speech in my spare time. It's always good to read your boss's old speeches. I was reading one that he did to the Royal Society of Arts in the early 2000s, and there he was recognising climate as a huge challenge, but he's also talking about the need for scientific investment and focus there. And I think this is a massive opportunity for Britain. Like, let's focus less on reducing our emissions. You know, we're accountable for less than 1% globally. And let's focus more on the things that we're good at, which is innovations in climate tech, innovations in carbon capture. And I think this could be a great export of the United Kingdom over many years, helping countries like China and India, who are accountable for most of the emissions, start to reduce theirs.
You're putting the message out about this paper. Will it have an impact with the political leaders of today?
I think so, because the one thing that unites all political leaders who I speak to about this issue is the desire to bring emissions down, to start to mitigate some of the challenges around climate, but ultimately to, over the long term, to start reverse the damaging impact of climate change. And I think now that the science and data is very clear that technology is absolutely central to that.
Thank you so much for joining me live. Good to talk to you. Interesting report, paper. Ryan Wayne is the Executive Director of Politics at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change.
Where the news never stops.